General Douglas MacArthur, in a speech delivered to Congress after he was relieved of his Far East command, said,
"Once war is forced upon us, there is no other alternative than to apply every available means to bring it to a swift end. War's very object is victory, not prolonged indecision. In war, there is no substitute for victory."
MacArthur was fired by President Truman because it appeared that he wanted to obtain this victory by launching an all-out war against communism. But in an age of atomic weapons that can reduce the world and all its people to ashes, the dangers of full-scale global war were giving way to an era of the limited war. The first of these limited wars was to be fought in Korea. During World War II, it was agreed by Allied leaders that Korea would be given its independence from Japan. After the war, Russia would accept the surrender of all Japanese troops north of the 38th parallel, and America would accept surrender south of the parallel. With the atomic bombing of Japan, World War II came to an abrupt end. Russian and American troops moved in and occupied Korea. In North Korea, the Russians immediately set out to communize the people with the aid of dedicated Korean communists trained in the Soviet Union. When the Soviet-American Commission could not agree on the details for setting up a provisional Korean government, the UN was asked to step in and organize elections that would unite the country. Russia claimed that this was beyond the power of the UN and would not allow elections in North Korea. South Korea then held its own election, and Syngman Rhee became president of the Republic of Korea. The Russians and North Koreans formed a government of their own and called it the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. For the first time in history, Korea was a divided country. In 1949, America withdrew its occupation troops from South Korea. The Russians claimed they withdrew their army, but would never allow the UN into North Korea to check. Even before the U.S. troops pulled out of Korea, communist agents were already at work with sabotage. After the Americans were gone, these efforts were accelerated and now included border raids and guerrilla attacks below the 38th parallel. At the UN, Russia did everything it could to discredit Syngman Rhee and the South Korean government. And on the morning of June 25, 1950, the North Korean communists started the war by launching an all-out attack across the 38th parallel. U.S. President Harry Truman said of the invasion,
"The attack was launched against the Republic of Korea on June 25th. That attack came without provocation and without warning. It was an act of raw aggression without a shadow of justification."
When word of the invasion reached the UN,
the next item on the agenda is complaint of aggression upon the Republic of Korea. In this connection, I should like
an emergency meeting of the Security Council was called. A resolution was passed calling for the immediate cessation of hostilities and the withdrawal of North Korean troops from South Korea. The North Koreans ignored this order. The UN passed a second resolution recommending that its members provide assistance to help South Korea repulse the invasion. Russia was boycotting the UN at the time over Red China's admission to the UN and was not present to veto these resolutions. On June 27, President Truman ordered the U.S. Air Force and Navy to help the South Koreans. The Security Council asked that a unified command be established under the UN flag and asked the U.S. to name a commander.
Under the flag of the United Nations, a unified command has been established for all forces of the members of the United Nations fighting in Korea. General Douglas MacArthur is the commander of this combined force. For the first time in all history, men of many nations are fighting under a single banner to uphold the rule of law in the world.
The well-organized North Korean invasion met very little resistance. The massive use of Russian tanks overwhelmed the South Korean troops, who retreated and were now fighting in the streets of Seoul, the capital of South Korea. In the panic to stop the North Korean advance, the 4 bridges that crossed the Han River south of Seoul were blown up, unfortunately trapping many South Korean troops in the city. By June 28, the North Koreans had taken Seoul. General MacArthur realized that American troops were needed. He received permission to commit American ground troops. The closest troops were stationed in Kyushu, Japan. They were moved to Korea and up to the front lines as quickly as possible. The North Koreans crossed the Han River and continued to drive the South Koreans back relentlessly. The first American troops to meet this advance were the members of Task Force Smith, a contingent of 540 men. They dug in 25 miles south of Seoul in Osan. Smith's forces withstood the enemy attack for 3 hours, but when their ammunition started to run out, Smith ordered a retreat. The most significant thing about this first engagement was the shattering of the belief that the North Koreans would run when they found they were up against American soldiers. The North Koreans did not run, but drove the UN and South Korean forces back to the Pusan beachhead. The beachhead held, and men and equipment were landed. By early August, the UN forces totaled 92,000 men, 47,000 of whom were American. General Walker would use these men to prevent any North Korean breakthrough. With Walker's forces holding the beachhead, General MacArthur unveiled a bold new war plan. His plan was an amphibious landing at Incheon, just 25 miles from Seoul, that would cut the North Korean supply lines and trap the North Korean army. The landing was a gamble because of the tides in the Incheon harbor. The rise and fall of the tides averaged 20 feet, and since the tide came in and went out very quickly, it could possibly strand the landing boats. Men from 230 ships began the invasion. The 5th Marines went in on the morning high tide and secured Walney-do, the heavily fortified island that guarded the Incheon port. That evening, on the 2nd high tide, the invasion of Incheon began. The troops poured ashore and moved inland with the North Koreans on the run. The Incheon landing was a success, and the UN troops now moved forward and recaptured Seoul. In the meantime, General Walker's troops had broken out of the Pusan beachhead. General Walker's army advanced north and on September 26 linked up with the Incheon invaders. On September 29, General MacArthur turned Seoul back to Syngman-ri. MacArthur's faith in the Incheon landing was justified, and congratulations poured in even from his harshest critics. By the end of September, just 3 months after the North Korean invasion, 130,000 North Korean soldiers had been taken prisoner, and all organized resistance south of the 38th parallel was at an end.
Commander-in-Chief, North Korean forces. The early and total defeat.
MacArthur broadcast the surrender terms to North Korea, but the only answer he received came from Communist China. The Chinese warned that if UN forces crossed the 38th parallel, they would send in their army to defend North Korea. President Truman and the UN members did not take this threat seriously, and they approved a resolution for the military reunification of Korea. On October 9, the UN troops crossed into North Korea in pursuit of the enemy. While the UN and South Korean forces were advancing to the north, President Truman and General MacArthur met on Wake Island to review the administration's policy with regard to Communist China. Truman told MacArthur that he did not want the Korean conflict to develop into a third world war because of Chinese intervention. MacArthur assured Truman that there was very little chance of the Chinese sending troops, but if they did, the UN Air Force could destroy them as they crossed the Yalu River. But even while Truman and MacArthur were meeting, Communist China had secretly moved over 100,000 troops into North Korea. These Chinese communists were battle veterans of the wars in China. They marched only at night and hid in the daytime. Moving with such secrecy, they were not detected. Meanwhile, UN and South Korean forces were advancing on all fronts, and by October 19, they had captured the North Korean capital of Pyongyang. But on October 25, the first Chinese soldiers were taken prisoner. Only then was it known that the Chinese army was in North Korea. Suddenly, the UN and South Korean forces found themselves locked in desperate battles with thousands of Chinese soldiers. In mid-November, UN and South Korean troops started an all-out drive toward the Yalu River. On November 27, near the Chosen Reservoir, the 5th and 7th Marine Regiments were struck by an overpowering Chinese force. The Marines fought with everything they had, often in bitter hand-to-hand combat. The temperature reached as low as 24 degrees below zero and rendered many of their weapons useless. Conditions looked so bad that MacArthur had written them off as lost. But the Marines had other ideas. They fought waist-deep in snow and up ice-covered mountains, carrying their wounded with them. If they stopped to rest, they would be in danger of freezing to death. By December 10, they had battled their way to the sea. They had suffered 4,400 battle casualties, and over 7,000 men were incapacitated temporarily from the sub-zero weather. A Navy fleet of 199 ships evacuated 105,000 troops, 91,000 Korean refugees, 17,500 vehicles, and 350,000 tons of equipment from the port of Hungnam. UN forces continued to retreat, and the Communists now occupied all of North Korea and part of South Korea. On December 26, General Ridgway took over command of the UN and South Korean forces. General Walker had died in a Jeep accident. When the Communists began this new offensive, General MacArthur warned that unless he received permission to bomb enemy supply lines and bases in China, the UN forces would probably be driven out of Korea. MacArthur's request was turned down. He was instructed to hold Korea if he could, but if casualties became too great, he was to evacuate his troops to Japan. But this would not be necessary. In a series of well-coordinated withdrawals, General Ridgway established a strong line of defense running from Pyeongtaek in the west to Samcheok in the east. Ridgway then launched a series of well-planned assaults. By the end of March, Seoul had been retaken, and UN and South Korean forces were back to the 38th parallel. During this time, the difference of opinion that existed between Truman and MacArthur came to a climax. President Truman said,
I have thought long and hard about this question of extending the war in Asia. I believe that we must try to limit the war to Korea. A number of events have made it evident that General MacArthur did not agree with that policy. I have therefore considered it essential to relieve General MacArthur so that there would be no doubt or confusion as to the real purpose and aim of our policy.
And General MacArthur answered,
I am closing my 52 years of military service. When I joined the Army, even before the turn of the century, it was the fulfillment of all my boyish hopes and dreams. The world has turned over many times since I took the oath on the plain at West Point, and the hopes and dreams have long since vanished. But I still remember the refrain of one of the most popular barrack ballads of that day, which proclaimed most proudly that old soldiers never die. They just fade away. And like the old soldier of that ballad, I now close my military career and just fade away. An old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty. Goodbye.
General Ridgway replaced MacArthur as commander of the Far East, and General Van Fleet was named commander of all UN and South Korean forces. Then, in April 1951, General Van Fleet's army met and stopped what would be the Communists' last all-out offensive. Van Fleet then launched a counteroffensive that pushed the Communists back. By now, the Communists realized they could not win the war. On June 23, Jacob Malik, Russia's UN delegate, suggested in a New York radio talk that discussions should begin for a ceasefire in Korea. The talks began on July 10, 1951, in Kaesong, a town between the two lines. There were stormy disagreements on many issues. On August 23, the North Koreans broke off the talks. On September 13, Van Fleet's forces renewed their offensive. These new attacks drove the North Koreans back to the conference table, now located in Panmunjom. While the peace talks went on, the fighting continued. Rival patrols clashed, and hills with names such as Porkchop Hill and T-Bone Hill were taken, then lost, and then retaken in small, violent battles. During the 2 years that the peace talks dragged on, over 60,000 UN and South Korean troops were lost in these types of action. The peace talks had been deadlocked over two main issues. The issue of where to establish the peace line was settled, but no agreement could be reached over the second issue, the exchange of prisoners. In February, General Clark, who had replaced General Van Fleet, proposed that sick and wounded prisoners be exchanged. In this exchange, called Little Switch, 684 prisoners, including 149 Americans, were exchanged for 6,670 communists. This exchange helped smooth the way for the renewal of the peace talks. By June 1953, the issue of prisoner exchange was agreed upon. The armistice was signed on July 27, 1953, at Panmunjom. The final exchange of prisoners, called Operation Big Switch, ended in September. The conflict claimed 33,629 American dead and 103,284 American wounded. Casualties, including dead, wounded, or missing for South Korea, were 300,000 military and 1 million civilian losses. North Korea had an estimated 1.5 to 2 million military and 1 million civilian losses. President Eisenhower summed up the first limited war America ever fought.
We have won an armistice on a single battleground, not peace in the world.